This is sort of a basic question, but in the last couple of years, as you know, there's been at least 200 million more individuals added to the poverty rolls, in part because of high food costs. At the moment, food costs of cereals are at unprecedented rates, have been for the last 2 years. The cost of energy, the cost of water are the two, and energy and water as a whole are the two main driving forces for high food productivity. Given all of this, what do you suppose is the timeline between what has been proposed at Copenhagen and when any actual sort of on-the-ground increase in productivity can be anticipated, and what sorts of things could we do in the interim?
Anybody else? Yeah, Randall.
That was a very good question. This is more of a process question with respect to the work program that we thought, the agricultural agenda that we put together that Saturday at Ag Day was going to be a part of. The technical program called the SBSTA, I'm not sure what that means, what the acronym stands for. Should there be an agreement, or should there be a link between the accord and an agreement? How important is it in terms of being able to access financing, being able to have an influence in the policy arena for agriculture to be part of that agenda in a more formal way? I think that, Jerry, you were very optimistic that the work is going ahead, but if it isn't formally part of the work agenda, are we missing out in terms of financing and policy?
Anybody else? Why don't you go? You guys start on those ones. Like, if there's any more, please.
Oh. Sure. Thanks. I think I'm on. Yeah. I think with regard to the first question on this, I guess, daunting challenge of how do we meet long-term food supply, I think that, well, and the short term as well. I think that's an issue separate from climate change. I think it's an issue that's important to address. I think it's exacerbated by climate change. But I think, I think you do. There needs to be an agenda to focus on that. I think, one of the things that I get concerned about is if we overlay too many things on the climate change agenda, then things stop entirely. And so, I think if we're going to make progress internationally in these negotiations, we're going to have to, basically focus on issues that are essential to climate change moving forward. It's not to say that it's not important to deal with those questions. You're raising questions, frankly, I don't have answers to, but they're important, and there are certainly important linkages between the climate change agenda and the food security agenda. With regard to the work program within SBSTA and getting that work initiated, I think the technical work program outside of SBSTA is probably even more important to get initiated. I think if you can look at the RED discussions and the fact that they have had a technical program of work within SBSTA on RED, technical is a relative term. And some of the discussions we have within the SBSTA are not extraordinarily technically sophisticated. And they tend to focus on things that are policy relevant. They tend not to be places where countries get together and decide we're going to finance a certain thing and get it going. They tend to be talk shops. Sometimes very important, and in fact, they're a way of moving forward collectively on action. I think the issues that you pick up and bring into a SBSTA work program need to be issues that can be resolved through negotiations and are currently a roadblock to action. The actions themselves are going to be undertaken by the FAO. They're going to be undertaken bilaterally, or on the research side, they can be undertaken within the context of the international research organizations or this new global alliance. Those activities are critical, not necessarily dependent on a SBSTA work program,
though. In terms of how important it is to have this in the mix for finance, I do agree a lot with what Bill just said, but to break it down a little between adaptation and mitigation. On the adaptation front, I think that agriculture is clearly recognized as a critical component of what needs to be addressed. And I think that adaptation funds will flow that way if we are assertive about ensuring that smallholders' interests and food security are an integral part of adaptation. So I don't think we have a particular problem there, except to make sure that that agenda is very much in the mix in all the institutions that are relevant. On the mitigation side, I think that we are in a sort of building block stage similar to what was done on RED, going back perhaps a decade or so. I think the question is, as RED finance starts, or let me put it differently, as mitigation finance starts to develop, is there still going to be space once the appropriate building blocks have been laid for agriculture mitigation to be part of the mix? And so I think we do need to be, I think by working with institutions like those that Bill named, I think we'll be able to create that space. That said, I think a lot of the building blocks still need to be put in place. I think we still need to figure out how does one do this in a way that's consistent with the interests of small farmers, consistent with food security in the mitigation context.
So on the Substa, Bill, you can correct me a little bit if I'm wrong on this, what the Global Alliance is, what the work program would be about. But certainly one element of this is this whole issue of monitoring, reporting, and verification of greenhouse gases, so that you could think of ways of putting agriculture formally into the mitigation part of the story. And the problem has been, how in the world do you ever test for soil carbon, or how in the scale it up to a large region or country, and so that's one of those things that you negotiate, and then so when you get the word agriculture into the mitigation part of the text, then the details get worked out further down the road in various working groups and various things like that, right? So, for example, with the CDM, the Global Environment Facility actually ended up writing a lot of the rules, the detailed rules, and so for something that wasn't included at sort of that high level in the CDM language, then doesn't get included getting written up in the detailed stuff. So what you want to do is first of all, you want to get stuff into the high level. You want to get the word agriculture scattered in appropriate places throughout the negotiating text. And I know Bill is going to tell us more in detail about the processes of the negotiations. But two critical things to look out for, I think, that again, we in the room need to think about, and that's the role of the NAMAs and the NAPAs. So both of those are sort of official UNFCCC activities. Countries are going to actually report to say, here's what we think needs to be done for adaptation in our country, and here's what we think we can do about mitigation. And so, I suspect it will be important to work with the countries to make sure that agriculture, for those countries where it's important, to make sure that they have a good understanding of what the issues are in their countries on agricultural adaptation and mitigation, and get it into the language of the NAPAs and the NAMAs, because there will be some tendency, I suspect, to say, we're going to take the adaptation funding and give it to a country for what it says it wants to do in its NAPA. So we need to get the right thing in the NAPA. Bill, is that roughly totally wrong, halfway in between?
No, I think I can't disagree with anything you said. I think, again, kind of coming back to whether to put a specific item on the Substa to work on a Substa work program. I think one of the issues that people have raised is that whether agriculture is eligible for the CDM.
Right.
And certain portions of it are. You can, there are projects to reduce methane and nitrous oxide emissions. I think soil carbon is a separate question, and that certainly is an issue. So you could develop a Substa work program to deal with that specific issue, to say, can we move forward in making progress in getting soil carbon projects eligible under the CDM? You'd have to get agreement that countries want to work toward that. And then you'd have to say, are there technical issues that are a roadblock? Is it measurement, monitoring, verification, or is it something else? Or could countries simply say, we probably made a mistake. We can go ahead and make these projects eligible for CDM crediting, and you don't need a work program. And so, we've proceeded with a Substa work program on agriculture cautiously, in part because where we are within the U.S., we think we have the flexibility to deal with agricultural mitigation domestically and internationally I think we have a fair amount of flexibility under the Copenhagen Accord to define how we would do that. And we wouldn't want to see a work program be a stumbling block where they'd say, well, we can't move forward unless you get answers to these unresolved questions. We think we can resolve those questions either domestically within the context of our domestic system or within the context of an international trading system that EPA might set up.
Let me just underscore, just very briefly, the first point Bill made in response to the first question, that the big food security and agricultural growth agenda really needs to go forward, whatever happens in Copenhagen. That includes the sustainable land and water management, investment in increasing investment in agricultural research, and maybe in the margin you shift a little more of the money into drought tolerance or heat tolerance, but the big yield growth enhancing agenda has to go forward. And whatever happens from Copenhagen. So I think that was great. Next round of questions. Back there, here, and way in the back.
Jason Funk, Environmental Defense Fund. Good to see you guys. I'm wondering if there was a process in the LULUCF negotiations relevant to Annex 1 countries and their accounting for forests, where at the end of the Bangkok meeting they were sort of given a homework assignment to come back and be prepared by Copenhagen to give a lot of detailed data about what they thought they were going to get out of forest accounting in the next round, the second commitment period. And I think that process added a lot of new information. I think it kind of helped the discussions move forward, but it could have just been some countries used it to kind of muddy the waters further. So I'd be curious to get your take on what you think that exercise contributed, and then whether you think a similar exercise that was opened up to developing countries as well for the issue of agriculture could help move that issue forward and sort of give an early, an early assignment to the Global Alliance for something for them to work on to support countries in bringing forth this data, if you think that would help move the process forward.
So we had another question right near the microphone, I think. And then we'll move up here.
Hi, I'm Roseanne Skerber with the Voice of America. It was mentioned that, I believe, with actions according to the Accord, that agriculture you should get the language in there about the importance of agriculture. But also, I'd like to know what language, if any, is already in the negotiating agreements, and are you encouraged going forward that there will be that agriculture will be actually named? Is it named in the agreement or in the Accord, aside from forestry?
And then right up here, and then way in the back over there. So.
Okay. I'm Deborah Zabarenko. I work for Reuters News Agency. This is mostly for Bill. Do we know any of the agenda items for this Global Research Alliance? What are they going to be talking about? And also, I was sort of interested in your optimism to sort of telling us all to buck up. Does that mean it's sort of not as bad as we all think? Or there really is, great reason for optimism here.
Okay, one more on this round, and then we'll have another round in a minute.
This is Seth Seamus, Eco Agriculture Partners. This is for Bill or anyone else on the panel or in the room who might have this information. So you spoke a bit about the level of funding from the U.S. for the Global Research Alliance, and I also read a couple of weeks back in an Economist article a number of $150 billion, and that seemed sort of a bit absurd. But is there a number of total commitments to this research alliance that's been gathered by anyone?
Okay, Bill, do you want to start again? There's a lot of people are hitting on you here.
Sure, and I might have to work backward. I don't know where with regard to the Global Research Alliance, don't know where that 150 billion number would have come from. I think we were putting forward an increase of 90 million over the next 4 years in research. It's the research that we're contributing to the Global Research Alliance. It's not the money. The objective of this research alliance is to get together, agree on common priorities, and move forward. We've had essentially a statement from ministers, our minister, the ministers of 23 other countries or their representatives, to get this alliance up and running. And we're going to have our first meeting in March or April in New Zealand. The statement that kicked off this alliance basically spells out a lot, but it leaves a lot of open questions I think the first of which will be what are the substantive technical work program areas. And we're envisioning a program area on intensive livestock, one on pastoral livestock, one on croplands, one presumably on rice. And then the next step would be to identify countries that can help coordinate those efforts, to identify the technical experts, get them together and work on exactly what are the substantive priorities in terms of developing technologies and practices to reduce emissions or increase sequestration within those technical work areas. And so that's going to be the work of this year, along with developing a charter or terms of reference that defines the role for the, say, the international research agencies, that defines a role for the private sector, defines a role for the commodity groups. You know, we want to make sure this is an inclusive process, that we have effective roles for our partners. And you know, there are a lot of open questions, but we do have commitments at the highest level of government to go ahead and get this work going. It's completely independent of the UN Framework Convention, and in fact, we're trying to keep it independent, although I think there's work that comes out of this research alliance that can be helpful in getting mitigation within the ag sector on the ground, and that would facilitate, I guess, progress within the negotiations themselves. Why am I optimistic? I think if you step back and you say, we have countries like China, India, Brazil putting commitments on the table, a number of other countries putting commitments on the table that haven't before, the U.S. having our president come forward and put our commitments on the table, including commitments to reduce emissions, commitments to help in financing. We had agreement on a long-term finance goal. I think there's an awful lot within this agreement to be positive about. And it does lay out a framework for moving forward. It is, in fact, I think the only framework for moving forward. I don't think we're going to get 120 world leaders together again to talk about climate change. I think that may be an unrealistic expectation. And in fact, you've gotten the world leaders to agree on this as a framework for moving forward. So from that perspective, I think, yeah, I am positive. I think there are a lot of details to be worked out, but I think there is a path forward on that. Data. Jason, you asked a question about data and whether the ag process would benefit from a data call, which is essentially what happened in the run-up to Copenhagen under the Kyoto Protocol side. I think information is always valuable. I think countries are expected to put information in their national communications and in their national inventories. I think that's the first place to go for this kind of information. But if there are holes or gaps or places where that information could be improved, certainly there have been times when countries have been asked for that information as part of the process. And you could see that as part of a work program where countries would be asked to improve their data on agricultural emissions or to identify what their domestic mitigation opportunities were. Yeah.
Jerry, David, how about the A word? Is it in there? Does agriculture appear in the text of the accord?
There is. It doesn't appear in the accord, but neither does transportation necessarily or other sectors. And so I think if you think of agriculture as a sector, I think it's in there. It's obviously in there. Within the underlying documents, there is a sectoral work paper that is going to be carried forward along with everything else, and the Ag Work Program is discussed within that.
Okay, thanks. One more round here? Yeah, sir.
Quickly, Bill, another A word is adaptation, and I'm wondering why adaptation is not part of the agenda of the Alliance, why you're focusing exclusively on mitigation. I mean, arguably, we know very little about how to target vulnerable people with what kinds of support to get them to a degree of resiliency that we can be confident about.
Great. Emmy? Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciated the sort of openness with which you talked about the various participants' interests in the conference. But you emphasized from the U.S. perspective kind of the participation from the administration. But clearly, in order to move ahead, policy-wise in the U.S., that sort of leadership needs to be shared in some way with congressional interests. And I guess the question is, to what extent are you confident that the legislative sort of backup for the heads of states' kind of commitments is going to be forthcoming, both here in the United States as well as in other key countries.
Good. We have a question here in the, oh, sorry, one back there and one in the front row then. Yeah. It's this gentleman right here. Please, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. Colin O'Neill with the Center for Food Safety. Thank you all very much. So I guess with the interest of small farmers in mind, and bringing up adaptation, mitigation, food security, where do you see the roles of agroecology, organic practices, and traditional agricultural knowledge being brought in with, in light of Copenhagen and moving forward with the Global Research Alliance?
Okay, one more here, and then we'll go back to the panel.
I'm Werner Kiene. I link up to Amy's question. I had a chance to talk to farmers groups, representatives from Germany and from here, and they are very critical about all this. In other words, how much were they present? What needs to be done to get them behind some of these ideas? If I have troubles here understanding all these acronyms, I think there's a big problem of getting this message understood by the population at large before anything will move. And what needs to be done, what can be done?
Jerry, you want to start this round?
And quickly, just a friendly reminder, if you could also respond to the earlier question from Roseanne Skirball from Voice of America, that'd be great. Thank you.
Responded to one of them, but I don't know about the other one. Yeah.
Well, let me respond actually to the agroecology traditional practices question. I have on a couple of occasions said that I think that agriculture is more complicated than rocket science. It's just that you only get one shot with a rocket, and with agriculture you get lots of shots to try out new and different things. And so my take on what traditional practices means is that farmers have practiced over years or decades, or in some cases centuries, to come up with practices that work best in their particular agroecological and niche and their cultural and economic niches as well. Agriculture is a very location-specific activity. So that would be my definition of what we mean by traditional practices. As we go forward in time, the climates of those locations are likely to change, the cultures are likely to change, and so is the economic environment. And so the practices that worked very well in some location today or 10 years ago or 30 years ago may not work very well in the future. We need to learn from those practices that work in those locations today, if for no other reason that some of the conditions that exist in those locations today may very well exist somewhere else 20 or 30 years from now. And I'm not talking about 10 or 50 kilometers down the road. I'm talking about 1,000 or 2,000 kilometers away in perhaps a different continent. So when I talk about global public goods, I'm talking about collecting information of that nature on what you might call traditional practices. I would just call it, good experimentation by people who are trying to make the best with what they have. So we need to collect that information, but I don't think we need to somehow hold it up as a sort of an ideal to aspire to. I think we need to figure out what works best for farmers in their location, given the conditions that they face. We need to learn from what they have learned in the past so that we can take advantage of that in other locations. And so we need to, one of the new ways in which we need to revitalize national research and extension programs is actually to facilitate that two-way sharing of information.
David, did you want to chip in on this one?
I wanted to take up the question about engaging small farmers in this process. And that is one of the things that we have been actively working to do over the course of the past year, especially. One of the ways we've been doing that is through the climate hearings that I referred to earlier. And those were events, for example, in Ethiopia that we held in 24 locations. And involved literally thousands, tens of thousands of people, and were an opportunity for local farmers to articulate what they are in fact seeing on the ground. We've done this in other countries as well, and I think one of the things that really needs to happen is providing an opportunity for local communities to be able to articulate what they are already seeing. Now, it's not to say that there's not climate data that that farmers, communities, et cetera, are not aware of. And so to some degree, we also need to be bringing the information there. But I think having the information flowing from that direction, actively providing opportunities for that to happen is a key part of the puzzle. And we've seen in the example of Ethiopia, for example, that it had a quite substantial effect on the government, in fact, and the prime minister became, I think there were sort of complications around the role that Prime Minister Meles ended up playing in Copenhagen. But I think that nonetheless, there was a clear engagement that was important for the way that the government played things out there. And I think one other thing just to note is that I think going toward Mexico, toward Cancun, that there is a lot of engagement by civil society with smallholders in Mexico and in other parts of Latin America, and I think that'll be an important dimension to work that's done around Copenhagen. Cancun.
Yeah, just real quickly, on the role for the congressional delegation and Congress, there was a very significant CODEL for the U.S. in Copenhagen, with a number of members, mostly on the House side, a couple of Senate members, but then also a large number of staffers. And it was quite important that they were there, because I think, given where we are in our domestic policy, and with a number of these issues being critical for, on the legislative side, I think it was critical for them to be there to explain where they are, the fact that we do have legislation that's passed the House and it's being discussed in the Senate. And that's going to be critical moving forward as well. I think this discussion we're having about the role of farmers themselves is really important. And when you look at where emissions come from globally, 20% of emissions in China come from agriculture, 25% in India. A majority of the emissions in Brazil and Indonesia come from land use change, including agriculture and forestry. And so engaging farmers, when we talk about expanding the role or activities on mitigation, is going to be critical. And I think the Global Research Alliance can play a role there. One technology, for example, anaerobic digesters. When we think of anaerobic digesters in the U.S., we're thinking of equipment that can cost from $200,000 to $1 million a piece. That's going to be capturing methane, generating electricity. We had a project or a program called Methane to Markets, and China participated, and they came in with something like, well, we have 18 million digesters in China. I'm not positive about the number, but we said, that's astonishing. And it turns out these are very low-tech, small-scale digesters where it's local farmers collecting manure, and in some cases in clay structures, and using that for residential heat and cooking. So the scale of technology is going to be different as we move from country to country. The opportunities are going to be different. We're going to need to be able to work that into this Global Research Alliance so we can understand, is there potential to expand that technology? What are the emissions that might be occurring from these digesters? Are there ways of improving them? And so that's going to be quite important. It's also going to be true in Europe as well, where I think agriculture has sort of taken a back seat in the discussions of their domestic policies. I think that's changing somewhat. I think I was very encouraged by what I saw in Denmark. There's a lot of activity in Denmark looking at having agriculture play an important role in their domestic commitments under the EU system.
Great. Time for maybe 2 or 3 more questions. You want to come back at us? Yeah.
I just wanted to come back and ask you about, just if you could sum up about the role agriculture played in Copenhagen. If you could just sum it up. Was it on the agenda, off the agenda, and did the accord or the negotiators, does it give you hope for the future? Did something come out of there, aside from what you were talking about that's outside of the of Copenhagen, the alliance, the global alliance that you were discussing? Were there any other things that were going on there?
Okay. One other one. Nobody's worn out of it. Jerry, can you give like a real pithy summing up of the role of agriculture and the negotiation processes there, and I know you talked about it, maybe.
That should be Bill because he was in the room doing the negotiating.
Well,
Bill, one thing you didn't answer was the role of adaptation in the global alliance.
Oh, right. Yeah, I think it's clearly in there in the context of food security and adaptation. There's clearly a link to adaptation. I think we had to make some tough decisions in setting this thing up. It's not an alliance that's dealing with forestry issues as well, primarily. And it's not to say that the need to have research focusing on climate change adaptation and agriculture isn't important. In fact, if you look at the $320 million we're going to be committing domestically within USDA, the majority of that's actually going to understanding the effects and adaptation responses. I think the view was among the Global Research Alliance countries that we needed to have coordination on mitigation technologies because there were lots of uncertainties that were being created because we were measuring things differently, that we were actually pursuing kind of in many cases the same research that was trying to tackle the same issues and we weren't coordinating. And so this was an initiative that was initially led by New Zealand, but we all joined on. In terms of kind of was agriculture at the table in Copenhagen, I think more so than at any meeting that I've been at. I think our secretary was there for 6 days and was busy all 6 days, participated in events from the FAO, from Ag Day, made announcements with U.S. farmers. We signed a new initiative with our dairy industry who's voluntarily committed to reducing emissions by 25%. And so I think Ag certainly was present, not just within the rooms, but also in the corridors and in the hallways and in the side events.
Any other, David, do you want to add, or Jerry? And we'll wrap up.
I agree that agriculture was present. I also just wanted to pick up on an earlier thread, if I could quickly, which is this question of optimism. And I think that there are a lot of details to be worked through going forward. And that's one of the critical tasks we have ahead. But I think we also need a re-energizing, sort of taking what was built for Copenhagen and really building it to the next level. And I think without that kind of impetus, so it's not just a details question, right? And I think without that kind of impetus, we won't get where we ultimately need to go. And so for those of us who see the parts of the glass that aren't full, I think what has to happen is much beyond detail work, but in fact that sense of political movement and momentum.
Jerry, any final last word?
Well, I just asked David, how do we do it?
Well, you guys can figure that out afterwards.
I'll just end again with my, it's a serious problem. We need to get started on it now, whether we do it under the guise of the official negotiations or other fora. I think we need to push in many different places.